On the morning of May 5, 1945, on top of a 400-foot limestone escarpment on the Japanese island of Okinawa, called the Maeda Escarpment by the locals, called Hacksaw Ridge by the American soldiers fighting on it, a 26-year-old United States Army medic named Desmond Doss received an order from his battalion commander to retreat from the top of the cliff. American forces of the 77th Infantry Division had been trying for several days to take and hold the top of the escarpment. They had been failing. Japanese forces, entrenched in a network of tunnels that the locals had been digging into the limestone for generations and that the Japanese had militarized over the previous 2 years, were inflicting catastrophic casualties on every American unit that reached the top. On the morning of May 5th, an estimated 75 American soldiers were lying wounded on the top of the escarpment. They could not walk. They could not climb down. The order to retreat applied to every able-bodied American on the cliff. It did not technically apply to the wounded. Desmond Doss, who had carried no weapon at any point in the 8 months he had been in active combat in the Pacific Theater, who had refused even to touch a firearm since the day he had enlisted in April 1942, who was a baptized Seventh-day Adventist Christian and a believer in the literal application of the Sixth Commandment of the Old Testament, considered the order to retreat. He looked at the 75 wounded American soldiers on the top of the cliff. He decided to stay. Over the next approximately 15 hours, Desmond Doss carried, one at a time, every wounded American soldier on the top of Hacksaw Ridge to the lip of the 400-foot escarpment. He tied a length of rope to each man. He lowered each man by hand down the face of the cliff to the soldiers waiting below. He went back to the top. He found the next wounded man. He repeated the process. He did this, by his own later count, 75 times. He did this without sleeping. He did this under continuous Japanese mortar and machine gun fire. He did this while praying aloud. Between rescues. The same sentence over and over again. Lord, please help me get one more. He had not, at any point during those 15 hours, picked up a weapon. On October 12, 1945, on the south lawn of the White House, Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector in the history of the United States military to receive the Medal of Honor. President Harry Truman pinned the medal to his chest personally. Truman told him, in the only sentence of their conversation that has been preserved, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Doss returned to civilian life. He had been at war for 3 years. He had been wounded 4 times. He had contracted tuberculosis during the Pacific Campaign, which would, over the next 5.5 years, cause him to lose 5 ribs and 1 of his lungs. He would never be able to work the carpentry trade he had trained for before the war. In 1976, 31 years after the Medal of Honor ceremony, an Army doctor at a Veterans Administration hospital, attempting to treat one of Doss's ongoing pulmonary infections, prescribed an antibiotic dosage that was approximately 5 times the safe maximum. Doss was permanently deafened by the antibiotic toxicity. He spent the next 12 years of his life unable to hear. In 1991, his wife of 49 years, Dorothy Shota, whom he had married 12 days before reporting for basic training, was killed in a car accident while driving him to a doctor's appointment. Doss survived the accident. Desmond Doss died at home in Piedmont, Alabama, on March 23, 2006. He was 87 years old. He was buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee. He had outlived 73 of the 75 men he had carried to safety from the top of Hacksaw Ridge. To understand how a Seventh-day Adventist medic from Lynchburg, Virginia, ended up alone on top of a 400-foot Japanese cliff carrying 75 wounded American soldiers to safety. You have to understand the framed picture that hung on the wall of his family's living room from approximately the time Desmond Doss was 9 years old. The picture was a large colored print distributed by the Seventh-day Adventist Church's publishing house in the 1920s, depicting the 10 Commandments. Each commandment was illustrated. The illustration for the 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," depicted the biblical story of Cain killing his brother Abel. The print showed Cain standing over Abel's body, holding a stone, with the words, "Thou shalt not kill," written in large letters above the scene. Desmond Doss looked at that print in his family's living room in Lynchburg every day of his childhood. He would later say, in interviews given decades after the war, that the image of Cain and Abel was the single most formative influence of his early life. He had decided, by the time he was approximately 10 years old, that whatever else he did in his life, he was not going to be Cain. He was born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, to Thomas and Bertha Doss. His father was a carpenter who had served briefly in the First World War and who, by his own son's later accounts, suffered from severe alcoholism throughout most of Desmond's childhood. His mother was a devout Seventh-day Adventist who raised her 3 children in the strict observance of the church's teachings: vegetarianism, Saturday Sabbath observance, abstention from alcohol and tobacco, and literal application of the Old Testament commandments. Desmond, by the recollections of family members collected in post-war interviews, was the most devout of the 3 children. He attended church every Saturday throughout his childhood and adolescence. He read the Bible cover to cover, by his own later admission, before he was 12 years old. He took, with a seriousness unusual for a child of his time and place, the Seventh-day Adventist commitment to nonviolence as a literal interpretation of the 6th commandment. He left school after the 8th grade and took a job at a shoe factory in Lynchburg. He moved, in 1939, to a better-paying job at the Newport News shipyard in coastal Virginia, where he worked as a ship carpenter on the construction of American Navy vessels. He met Dorothy Schutte in 1940 at a small Seventh-day Adventist church in Lynchburg. They were married on August 17, 1942, 12 days before Desmond reported for basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Desmond Doss, when his draft notice arrived in April 1942, told the draft board that he was prepared to serve in the United States military, that he was prepared to wear the uniform, that he was prepared to be assigned to any combat unit the Army wished to send him to, but that he would not carry a weapon and would not personally take a human life under any circumstances. He told the draft board that he did not consider himself a conscientious objector, a term he found insufficient. He described himself as a conscientious cooperator. He was prepared, he said, to participate fully in the war effort, to put himself in the most dangerous situations the Army wished to send him to, and to save the lives of American soldiers. But he was not prepared to take the lives of enemy soldiers. He reported to Fort Jackson on August 29, 1942. He was assigned to the medical detachment of the 307th Infantry Regiment, part of the 77th Infantry Division. This unit was being reactivated for service in the Pacific Theater. The men of the 307th Infantry Regiment did not, in the autumn of 1942, want a conscientious objector in their unit. They had been told that the man assigned to their medical detachment was a religious fanatic who had refused, on doctrinal grounds, to handle a rifle. They had been told that his presence in their unit was, in the assessment of the Army officers responsible for the assignment, an administrative experiment. Within the first week, his fellow trainees had begun to actively harass him. They threw their boots at him while he was praying. They put his Bible in a toilet. They demanded that he stop praying so they could sleep. He continued to pray. They continued to harass him. The harassment continued for the entire duration of basic training. Doss, by his own later account, did not respond to any of it. He told his squad mates that he was prepared to forgive them for what they were doing, that he understood why they distrusted him, and that he would, when the time came, do everything in his power to save their lives in combat. They did not believe him. Several attempts were employed by the 307th officers to have Doss either discharged from the Army on the basis of mental incompetence or transferred to a civilian public service unit. The attempts failed. Doss refused to be discharged. He refused to transfer. He insisted on remaining in his medical detachment. By the time the 77th Infantry Division was deployed to the Pacific in March 1944, the men of the 307th Infantry had grudgingly accepted his presence. They still did not like him. They still considered him a religious fanatic, but they had stopped trying to get rid of him. The 77th Infantry Division landed on Guam on July 21, 1944, as part of the American campaign to recapture the island from Japanese occupation. The combat on Guam was, by Pacific theater standards, severe but manageable. The American forces took the island in approximately 3 weeks. Desmond Doss, throughout the Guam campaign, treated wounded American soldiers under enemy fire. He recovered American casualties from positions that had been overrun by Japanese forces. He was awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device for his actions during the campaign. He was, by the end of the campaign, no longer considered a religious oddity by the men of his regiment. He was considered a medic. Whatever they had previously thought about his refusal to carry a weapon had been, by the practical experience of the campaign, replaced by the simpler observation that he was, in combat, the man they wanted with them when they were wounded. The regiment was sent on to the Philippines in late 1944. The Battle of Leyte, fought between October 1944 and the end of December, was substantially worse than Guam. The Japanese had concentrated significant forces on the island. The American casualty rates were severe. Doss earned a second Bronze Star with Valor Device on Leyte. He also, during the campaign, contracted the tropical strain of tuberculosis that would, 18 months later, cost him 5 ribs and 1 of his lungs. He did not know he had tuberculosis at the time. In late March 1945, the 307th Infantry was assigned to participate in the planned American invasion of the Japanese island of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa was, by the standards of the entire Pacific War, the largest, longest, and bloodiest engagement of the campaign. American forces landed on the island on April 1, 1945. The Japanese garrison numbered approximately 120,000 men. The American invasion force eventually committed approximately 180,000 combat troops to the engagement. The battle would last for 82 days. The 307th Infantry Regiment, as part of the 77th Infantry Division, was assigned to the central sector of the American advance. By late April 1945, the regiment had reached the foot of the Maida Escarpment, a 400-foot limestone cliff running east-west across the central plateau of Okinawa. The Japanese had spent the previous several years constructing a network of tunnels through the limestone of the escarpment. The tunnels were interconnected. They had multiple entrances and exits. They were defended by, at the height of the battle, approximately 3,000 Japanese infantry. The Maida Escarpment, by the time the 307th Infantry reached it on April 29th, had been nicknamed by American soldiers as Hacksaw Ridge. The American assault on the top of the escarpment began on April 29th. American soldiers climbed the cliff face using cargo nets that had been thrown over the lip of the escarpment from above. The Japanese, defending the top, used a combination of machine gun fire, mortar fire, and small arms fire to inflict catastrophic casualties on every American unit that reached the top. The 307th Infantry was on the top of Hacksaw Ridge in various engagements between April 29th and May 5th, 1945. Desmond Doss was on the top with them. On the morning of May 5th, 1945, the Japanese launched a coordinated counterattack against the American positions on the top of the escarpment. The counterattack inflicted approximately 75 casualties on the 307th Infantry within the first 90 minutes. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Cooney, the battalion commander, ordered an immediate retreat. Every able-bodied American on the top of the escarpment was to climb down the cargo nets to the American positions below. Desmond Doss, who had been treating wounded American soldiers in a small depression in the rock surface at the top of the escarpment, considered the order. He looked at the wounded men around him. He counted them. He counted approximately 75. He did not retreat. He picked up the first wounded soldier near him. He carried the soldier on his back across approximately 50 meters of open ground that was under continuous Japanese machine gun fire. He reached the lip of the escarpment. He tied a length of rope, improvised from a length of cargo net cordage, to the wounded soldier's chest and shoulders. He lowered the wounded soldier, by hand, down the 400-foot cliff face to the American soldiers who had reached the bottom of the cliff and who were waiting to catch each man as he descended. He returned to the top of the escarpment. He found the next wounded soldier. He repeated the process. Between approximately 10 o'clock in the morning and approximately 1 o'clock the following morning, Desmond Doss lowered 75 wounded American soldiers, one at a time, down the face of Hacksaw Ridge. He did the work alone. He worked under continuous Japanese fire. He took no breaks. He prayed, between rescues, the same sentence over and over again. Lord, please help me get one more. He did this 75 times. He had been on the top of the escarpment, by his final count, for approximately 15 hours. Desmond Doss remained with the 307th Infantry Regiment on Okinawa for the next 16 days. He continued to treat wounded American soldiers under fire. He continued to refuse to carry a weapon. He was wounded twice by Japanese small arms fire during this period, both wounds minor enough that he treated them himself and remained on active duty. On the night of May 21, 1945, during an unsuccessful American night raid on a Japanese fortified position, Doss was sharing a small foxhole with several other American soldiers when a Japanese hand grenade landed in the foxhole. Doss kicked at the grenade in an attempt to throw it out before it detonated. He was not successful. The grenade detonated in the foxhole. The shrapnel from the explosion tore into both of Doss's legs. He was severely wounded. He was unable to walk. The other American soldiers in the foxhole, who had been only lightly injured by the explosion, immediately called for a medical evacuation team. Doss waited for the evacuation team. The team did not, given the intensity of Japanese fire that night, arrive immediately. Doss waited for, by his own later count, approximately 5 hours. When the evacuation team finally arrived and placed Doss on a stretcher to carry him back to the American lines, Doss observed that another wounded American soldier nearby, wounded more seriously than Doss, had been left waiting for transport. Doss crawled off the stretcher. He directed the medics to evacuate the other man first. While Doss was waiting alone on the ground for the medics to return, a Japanese sniper, observing the wounded American soldier on the ground, fired a single rifle shot. The bullet struck Doss in the upper left arm. It shattered his humerus, the long bone of the upper arm, approximately 3 inches above his elbow. Doss, by then in his 5th hour of severe injury, alone on the ground, under continuous fire, picked up the wooden stock of a rifle that had fallen near him in the firefight. He bound the rifle stock to his shattered arm with strips torn from his own uniform. He used the rifle stock as a splint. He did not, at any point during the splinting process, touch the rifle's trigger, action, or barrel. He used only the wooden stock. On October 12, 1945, Desmond Doss stood on the south lawn of the White House in his United States Army dress uniform. President Harry Truman pinned the Medal of Honor to Doss's chest. He shook Doss's hand. Truman told him, in the only sentence of the conversation that has been preserved, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Doss was the first American conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor in the history of the United States. He would remain, for the duration of his life, the only conscientious objector ever to receive it for actions in the Second World War. He was discharged from the Army in 1946. He attempted to resume work in carpentry. He could not. The tuberculosis he had contracted in Leyte was, by the time of his discharge, severe. The disease would, over the next 5.5 years, require the surgical removal of 5 of his ribs and the removal of his left lung. He would never, after 1946, be able to perform the kind of physical labor he had trained for before the war. He and Dorothy moved to a small farm in the rural community of Rising Fawn, Georgia, in the early 1950s. They had one son named Desmond Doss Jr. They lived quietly. Doss spoke occasionally at Seventh-day Adventist church services across the southeastern United States about his wartime experiences. In 1976, 31 years after the Medal of Honor ceremony, Desmond Doss was admitted to a Veterans Administration hospital in Tennessee for treatment of one of the recurring pulmonary infections that had become routine in his post-tuberculosis life. The hospital physician who treated him prescribed an antibiotic medication at a dosage that was, by the standards of the medical pharmacology of the time, approximately 5 times the safe maximum for a patient of Doss's age and weight. The medication was administered. Within 48 hours, Doss had lost almost the entirety of his hearing in both ears. The antibiotic had caused permanent and irreversible damage to the auditory nerves in his inner ears. Desmond Doss spent the next 12 years of his life unable to hear. He continued to give public talks during this period. He did so after 1976 with the assistance of his wife Dorothy, who would stand next to him at the podium and write each audience question on a small chalkboard so that Doss could read it before responding. In 1988, the Veterans Administration approved Doss for one of the first generations of cochlear implants. The implant restored partial hearing in his right ear. It did not restore his ability to fully understand spoken language without lip reading. On November 17, 1991, Dorothy Doss, who had been with him for 51 years, who had supported him through the conscientious objector controversies of 1942, the war years, the tuberculosis, the surgical losses of his ribs and lung, the Veterans Administration hearing loss, and the public speaking circuit that had become their joint vocation in his later years, was killed in a car accident on a highway in rural Alabama. She was driving him to a doctor's appointment in Birmingham at the time of the accident. Doss, who had been the passenger in the car, survived. He sustained moderate injuries. He recovered. He remarried 2 years later, a Seventh-day Adventist widow named Frances Dumont. He and Frances lived quietly in Piedmont, Alabama, for the remainder of Doss's life. He continued to give talks. He continued to refuse, at any of those talks, to handle the firearms that were sometimes brought by curious veterans who wanted him to demonstrate, by holding a weapon, what he had refused to hold during the war. The Australian-American film director Mel Gibson, in 2016, 10 years after Doss's death, released a feature film about Desmond Doss's actions at Hacksaw Ridge. The film, titled Hacksaw Ridge, starred the British actor Andrew Garfield as Doss. It received 6 Academy Award nominations, including Best Picture. It introduced Desmond Doss to a global audience that, until that point, had largely not known his name. The film did not, by the nature of Hollywood feature filmmaking, capture the 60 years of his life that came afterward: the tuberculosis, the loss of the ribs and the lung, the Veterans Administration hearing accident, the death of Dorothy in the car crash, the cochlear implant, the quiet church talks given to small Alabama audiences for decades after the war ended. Desmond Doss died at home in Piedmont, Alabama, on March 23, 2006. He was 87 years old. The cause of death was complications of the breathing difficulties that had defined his post-tuberculosis life for the previous 59 years. He was buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee. Among the men who attended his funeral were several of the surviving members of the 75 soldiers he had lowered down Hacksaw Ridge on May 5, 1945. By the time of Doss's death, only 2 of the 75 were still alive. Both attended. Neither of them, in their public statements at the funeral, spoke about the Medal of Honor. They spoke instead about the fact that, when they had been lying wounded on the top of a 400-foot Japanese cliff in May 1945, with their unit ordered to retreat, with the Japanese counterattacks coming in waves, with their own ability to walk or climb down completely destroyed, the man who had stayed had been an unarmed Seventh-day Adventist medic from rural Virginia. They had survived because of him. They had each lived, by their own counts, more than 80 years afterward. They had each had children. They had each had grandchildren. And every one of those years, every one of those children, and every one of those grandchildren had existed because Desmond Doss, who refused to be called a conscientious objector and preferred the term conscientious cooperator, who had never once handled a firearm during the entire Second World War, who had spent 15 unbroken hours on the top of a Japanese cliff on May 5, 1945, had prayed, between each rescue, the same sentence over and over again: "Lord, please help me get one more."